The crucial question that I asked was about motives for volunteering. Can you explain why you wanted to do voluntary work? What motivated you? That was the key question. In terms of research results, overall, 3 areas of voluntary work were explored. Students who did work that was prison-based voluntary work, youth justice-based voluntary work, and victim witness support. Okay, and there's some numbers there for you. In terms of routes into volunteering, by far the majority of students suggested that their programme of study at university had been the spur to their voluntary work. Several commented upon training, by the by, but I'm not going to go into detail on that at the moment. Motivations for doing voluntary work. Almost all gave several, multiple, combined reasons for doing voluntary work. These tended to include each of these 4 motivations or reasons. Opportunities to help people, related to future careers, gaining insight into work for an agency, gaining advantage in the graduate labour market. Now, probably nothing startling there, nothing terribly surprising. There was a combination of all of these. I think, this fairly typically reflects a range of sort of goal-oriented motivations. Altruistic reasons for helping people, doing good, but also reasons related to the individual and the self. So here's some quick quotes from the different sectors of voluntary work that students were involved in. To obtain necessary experience within prison, to empathise with people who are sucked into that system. But also, alongside that, juxtaposed together with that, also important for me to gain relevant experience, because I would love to gain employment. And you can read the rest of those quickly for yourself. So, a combination of reasons coming through. So, work experience was significant amongst the range of motives, the opportunity to try out different jobs, as connected to the criminal justice system was mentioned often, yet it was also embedded in a broader range of reasons for volunteering. Helping, meeting and empathising with others were amongst those motives. I want to share with you some of the experiences and reflections, because I think this reflects how student motivations appeared to change during the course of and their engagement with voluntary work. They seem to become reflective practitioners almost in the midst of their doing the voluntary work. So, whilst Katie, for example, was looking forward to a more rewarding experience with the youth offending team, Sally, after having experienced successfully supervising her first teenage boy, was asked by her supervisor if she'd be willing to mentor an older boy who had been convicted of more serious offences. And Sally wrote this, mentions disappointment. I never got back in touch. I felt a little bit used. At the same time as having thoroughly enjoyed the experience. So these sorts of observations perhaps reinforce the importance of recognising students' not only motivations but their needs. Students have needs. So I think it's important to recognise not only the motivations but the needs related to those motivations in respect of voluntary work connected to the criminal justice system. Ooh. They also signify how students are learning to be critical of volunteering as a result of their experience. A significant theme also arising very much from the prison-based volunteers came through, especially in the reflective written narratives. And I would suggest that the written narratives were the more considered and thought through parts of the research findings. I think that's important. And the significant theme here was around judgmentalism. And Mary wrote, it helped me to be able to work with a more diverse group of people, to understand their different lives, different lives people endure and how circumstances beyond people's control can dictate people's fate. Help me to learn to observe in an impartial way, to be less judgmental. Such comments, I think, mirror findings from elsewhere on students' personal values in relation to volunteering, that show volunteering offers learning opportunities, particularly about other people's experiences. And I was also particularly struck by the number of students who mentioned being nervous, a little bit like myself at the moment, at the start of their volunteering. And a number of students mentioned being nervous in their, both in the interviews and in the narrative accounts. In terms of the discussion then, okay, student motivations. I want to talk about two main issues arising from these findings. First, student motivations in this respect. I would suggest that the analysis that I've done draws on earlier models of motivations to volunteer in different contexts. And those earlier models tend to identify outwardly disparate and often purely functional motivations across a range of different voluntary activities and behaviours. The traditional way of describing volunteer behaviour, or motivation, is in terms of either egoism or altruism. You know, the two sort of separate goals. So Gillen Morby, over 20 years ago, suggested that the traditional way of describing volunteer motivations in terms of egoism or altruism must be questioned. That study outlined 6 categories of motivations to volunteer in 3 agencies: probation, police, victim support, though none of their volunteers appeared to have been students at the time. The 6 categories identified were other-directed, self-directed, career-directed, organisational or agency-directed, religious-based, and the last category was drift. Now, I think those are important because I think they can be fitted in to this kind of typology that I've drawn up, if you like. So on the left-hand column, if you like, is one set of goal orientations. On the right-hand column is another set of goal orientations, and they represent those 2 extremes, egotism or altruism. Okay? In the middle, what Gillen Morby were beginning to suggest is that the category they identified of drift was significant and important. And I think those drift volunteers could be slotted into a middle compartment there that isn't so easily identified as having specific goals, whether altruistic or egoistic. So I think the Morby and Gill kind of typology is useful. I think they were right in identifying almost a new category of volunteer, that drift was not unimportant. No specific goal orientation, kind of mixed economy of orientations, diverse and contrasting reasons. You know, being altruistic, but yes, individually motivated to get something out of it as well. Okay, so it's in Morby and Gill's words, this is contingent and habitual approach. Volunteer because they want to, because of the sheer pleasure of it sometimes. So a kind of mixture of egoistical and altruistic drivers. Almost the phrase sometimes used in more modern literature is altruistic individualism. Are students altruistic individualists? Is that an appropriate kind of category? I wonder. Okay. So that's the sort of putting it in the bigger context of the sort of analytical literature. I think another set of important findings that came out, that I'd like to spend a few moments talking about, has direct policy relevance. And these concern volunteer management, expectations and rewards, and therefore focuses on practical matters concerning organising and deploying volunteers. So the findings, I think I've very briefly reported upon, suggest there are lessons for agencies here in terms of maximising volunteers' potential. Now, if you think about the movement towards the big society, the philosophy of that and the political concerns that merge together suggest that this volunteering is only going to be a growth industry in the future. And that if students appear to fit that bill, I think it's very important that we begin to address students' motivations and students' needs. At the moment, it's almost as if volunteering is taken as a self-evident good thing to do, that it can only ever bring those volunteers good rewards. But as yet, some of those rewards aren't proven. Okay? So we might be holding out false hopes and expectations. Several students, and I've briefly evidenced this, had constructive criticisms of their voluntary work experiences. And it seems that in order to maximise student volunteers' potential in criminal justice contexts, in the short, medium and longer term, several practical things might be addressed. These include speeding up the recruitment and selection process of of applying to become a volunteer, deploying students, giving them work, supervising and coordinating volunteers effectively. Some were very evidently frustrated by the lack of work and poor communication and continuity and future deployment arrangements. There was frustration among students about those things. The provision of work, therefore, is absolutely crucial to volunteer morale and happiness with their volunteering experience. So it's important perhaps that volunteers feel integrated not only at the outset of their work in any given agency, that they've been interviewed and professionally recruited, so integrated from the outset, but they feel integrated throughout their experience of work at that agency. Okay? So that the deployment and the supervision and the provision of more work in the future is assured and the communication of that fits well. Whilst all took part in a strict selection process and set of procedures, and all engaged in initial training programs, none, as far as I could find out, appeared to have been offered continued or further professional development opportunities. So, conclusion. I think there are two interrelated research questions that seem relevant to developing a better appreciation of what drives young adults to volunteer for specific types of voluntary work. One of these questions relates to the demographic group of young adults and their subgroups, and the other relates to the match between these different subgroups and varieties of volunteering experiences. So which students volunteer for and why, and what do they hope and expect to get from it? This research suggests it's important to consider students' motivations that are needs related. The importance of aligning motivations with experiences that meaningfully relate to these motivations is highlighted, with students wanting challenging voluntary work experiences. And I think these matters are of import to agencies wanting to induce commitment to voluntary work. And finally, I think there's evidence of the continuing assumption of the mutual good of volunteering. that it is self-evidently a good thing to do. Now, for this group of students, some of their reasons for volunteering were rewarded. They got their payback. For several, invaluable skills were further developed and put to effective practical use. Most seem to have enjoyed personal rewards from their experiences. They sort of noticed some added value that they got out of it. Their employability competencies are mostly, however, as yet unproven. And several of the assumed benefits of their volunteering remain largely unexplored. So where motivational reasons for volunteering are linked to their future employment prospects, I think there is as yet, and other evidence and literature supports this, there is no evidence of these assumed benefits yet. So, more research. Thank you.